All right, guys. So we're gonna do this a little bit different this time. We've been doing notes where I'm in the classroom, but I won't be doing it in the classroom this time. I'm just gonna try doing this from home, uh, and just send it with you. With you to be able to see the slides mostly. Don't even have to look at my face hardly. So uh, first thing before we get going, I'm gonna do something different with this day in history and famous birthdays. As part of the assignment for this uh, the notes you're taking on this, the assignment I'm giving out for the chapter 21 notes for the beginning of this, I would like you to put something that happened on this day in history and a famous birthday from today in the answers. You guys will get credit for that. I only need one thing, though, from this day in history and one birthday. I don't really want more than that from each person. Just that would be one of the ways you can get some points on this assignment, along with the questions that I sent out in the email. Okay, so we are going to begin looking at chapter 21. We're going to be looking at the time period between World War I and World War II. Very interesting time period in history. We're first today going to look primarily at some of the democratic countries that don't become dictatorships or communist countries or anything like that. So we'll be looking at Great Britain, France, the United States, and we'll briefly look at totalitarianism today, and then we will save the Soviet Union for later this week. But this is, like I said, a very interesting time period in history. So let's start with the Great Depression. Not Great Depression, Great Britain. So obviously, as you come out of World War I, countries are affected in very different ways. For most of the countries, they had a lot of economic problems coming out of World War I. Great Britain would be one of those. You begin to see a decline in their empire. So obviously, with all of the colonies that they had over time and just their powerful position in the world, it begins to kind of wane and get smaller and smaller as they come out of World War I. Unemployment became a major problem in some areas like coal mining. It almost completely shut down, and overall, they had an unemployment level of about 25% during some of the early years after World War I was over. That's something that the United States would experience in the Great Depression, but the Great Depression isn't until after a decade after World War I is over. So Great Britain's hit pretty hard. Part of the economic problems, too, is they were in a great amount of debt. They're 10 times the amount of debt that they were in 1914 as they come out of the war. One of the things they do to try to answer some of these problems is they try to create protective tariffs. So first, let me tell you what a tariff is. Okay, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. A tax on imported goods. Now, every country has tariffs, and Great Britain up to this point in time already had tariffs as well. But a protective tariff takes it to a whole new level. So it's a percentage the countries will charge basically for imports to come into their country. A protective tariff means you raise the amount that you're charging, so you charge a higher rate for goods to come in, which discourages trade with other countries. The hope is that it would encourage for your own businesses to succeed and for them to hire people because it's cheaper to just make the goods in your country. The goal is to try to find a happy medium where you are getting goods from other countries, but where you're also kind of protecting the businesses in your country. So it's kind of a fine line to walk. But we're going to see during this time period in general, countries begin to put more protective tariffs up and begin to really raise the amount of money that they are charging countries to bring in imported goods. You also had the rise of people living on the dole. Now, that's what they would call it in Great Britain. That simply means people on welfare. People were counting on the government and social welfare programs to help take care of their needs. Like I said, partly due to unemployment. So people were staying at home while they're looking for jobs, but they would be getting some money. Some people began to do this for a longer term. But you definitely saw a huge, dramatic rise in the welfare programs in Great Britain in the 1920s and 1930s. Another important thing is this creates like a welfare state. Now, an important individual is Ramsay MacDonald, okay, who was the head of the Labour Party, which is still one of the two major parties in Great Britain. Up to this point in time, the period, the Labour Party was not a major party, but Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labour Party prime minister in British history. This is important because the Labour Party is pretty much socialist. They are looking very much for a heavy amount of government control of the economy and encouraging the growth of government to try to create more of the system they're looking for. Now, they did not remain in power for very long. They were soon ousted, but they became a major force in British politics during this time period and have continued to be so until this day. You also had all the issues, partly with, um, like I said, the British controlling so many different colonies, so many different areas on the globe. Okay, so one of the things is that Ireland had been under British control, but Ireland becomes free in 1921 from Great Britain and becomes their own independent country. Now, Northern Ireland, which to this day still remains a part of Great Britain, but otherwise the rest of Ireland is a free state. In Egypt, they also continued to look for their freedom and independence there, and they were able to gain their independence from British rule. However, the British did maintain a naval base there along the Suez Canal. That will be important in World War II. We'll talk about some of that stuff when we get to World War II, talking about the importance strategically of the Suez Canal. British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which gave India more independence. Now, it didn't give them full independence, but it gave them more ability to rule themselves in 1935. The Statute of Westminster, which was passed in 1931, declared Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa to be autonomous communities within the British Empire. So they pretty much were granted almost complete control over their countries and were no longer quite under the same type of control that the British had on them before. So that's kind of what's going on in Great Britain. Things obviously aren't going very well. Let's turn our attention to France. Now, France has some things that are worse and some things that are better than the British. One thing, they definitely have a lot more to recover from as far as the destruction of their land and their property. World War I did not take place on the island of Great Britain or in England. It only happened in France, primarily in the Western theater of the war. So there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done. Lots of property that had been destroyed. The French definitely suffered more loss of life as well, especially to citizens, than the British did. However, they're able to achieve greater economic recovery. There's a few reasons for this. Germany had to return some areas to France, Alsace and Lorraine being part of that, and that was heavy in coal and oil and other rich resources that were needed to help rebuild. So some of the land France got back helped them rebuild. The main industrial region in France that had been destroyed was completely rebuilt with new factories, which is kind of important. The British still had their old factories, which were kind of getting out of date. So the French, even though it cost money to rebuild their factories, they built more modern, new factories, which worked better. So they were able to become a more modern type of factory system. France was also a favorite tourist center in Europe, so a lot of people went to France to visit. This helped their economy recover as well. And because of its geographical proximity to Germany, France was often able to get their reparation payments better than Great Britain and other countries as well. Now, that's the economic recovery. But politically, it was still very unstable. So to put it in perspective, they have a different type of government in France than we have in the United States. It's something we'll discuss more next year in government class. But they have something that has more than two major political parties. The positive there is you get more different types of political parties and more voices in government. The problem is it's hard to get a majority in government. So you have to create coalitions. So what happens is you typically have to get 2 to 3 political parties to work together to create a majority. And they don't have like an election every 2 years or every 4 years or anything like that. It's basically their government functions and eventually it shuts down when there is no longer a majority and they have to have a new vote. So this could last for a long time before they need votes, but it could be a terrible amount of time, however, terribly short amount of time. Meaning, and this is important, from 1920 to 1940, 20-year period, France changed prime ministers some 40 times. 40 times they changed prime ministers. It doesn't mean there were 40 different ones, because some people might serve more than once, but they flip-flopped back and forth 40 times. That's every half year on average, because they could not create a coalition government. It's also during this time period that you had a real rise in socialism and communism in France. They started something called the Popular Front, became kind of the name of their political party. Um, they did gain control of the government, naming Leon Blum the prime minister um, in one of those years. But once again, this fell apart, kind of like it did in Great Britain. The Labour Party didn't last very long. But for a short time, the socialists and communists controlled the government in France, but they went in a different direction after that. Well, foreign affairs. Uh, Obviously, France and Germany are very close together, and that plays a role in France being more concerned about Germany and Germany becoming aggressive once again. So France creates some alliances with different countries, mostly because the British and the United States aren't going to guarantee France they will come to their aid if Germany attacks them again. Just because at this point in time, France and I mean Germany and sorry, I can't even say the right countries here. Great Britain and the United States are kind of wanting to stay out of another war, so they don't want to give any guarantees to France. So France makes alliances instead with some Eastern European countries. Those countries being Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Those would be on the eastern side of Germany, and having an alliance with them would hopefully discourage Germany from ever attacking. When 1929, under the leadership of André Maginot, the French began building a line of reinforcements to try to create a defensive line to help negate the possibility of an attack by Germany. This becomes known as the Maginot Line. So many Frenchmen believed the Maginot Line would stop any future German attacks. These fortifications are built oftentimes in hills, and it would have turrets on top, turrets in the front. There was an intricate system of elevators going down deep into the ground under the earth. There were subway stations uniting the different defensive fortifications along the Maginot Line. There was a hospital below ground. There were places for the men to sleep. There were recreation areas, movie theaters, the whole 9 yards. All the goods being stored underground. There's a drawing of it in your book on page 547 that I encourage you to look at. But the Maginot Line, in theory, seemed very good. Seemed to be a way to keep Germany from attacking. The thing is, the attacks are going to be much faster in the next war. The Maginot Line does slow down the Germans a little bit, not very much. But the French people did have a lot of confidence that the Maginot Line would keep them safe from future German attack. So let's turn our attention to the United States. Okay, after the war was over, many wanted a policy of isolation to try to remain isolated out from under the policies that got us into World War I. They're kind of like, we want to distance ourselves. Obviously, I mentioned this towards the end of last chapter. The Senate defeated the Versailles Treaty, so the United States never joined the League of Nations during this time period. So they didn't play a role in that. They did. Doesn't mean they didn't play any roles in anything. We talked about the Washington Naval Conference and the Dawes Plan and those types of things, trying to help out internationally. But still, for the most part, America wanted to stay out of European politics. You get several presidents during this time period of the 1920s, which would be known as the Roaring Twenties. You actually have a time of prosperity for the United States. So as Great Britain and France are rebuilding and struggling financially, along with the other countries you mentioned, Germany, Soviet Union, going through, and Italy, going through many of the same things where they're having problems economically. The United States actually goes through a prosperous time period in the 1920s. Also, World War I, you can almost signify this as the time when the United States became a world power. Now, I'm not saying a superpower, but the United States Before World War I was seen as a fairly powerful country, but by the end of World War I, because America lost a lot less, and because America wasn't affected as much by World War I, America comes out looking pretty good and pretty strong. So as Warren G. Harding becomes president, he wants to do a return to normalcy, to kind of get life back to normal. And for the most part, people got jobs back. Farmers did struggle during the 1920s, but most of the rest of the people did not. Things did really well. You after that had Calvin Coolidge as president. Calvin Coolidge was incredibly conservative as a president, and he, liked to not get a lot of government involved in a lot of different things. But you kind of continue to see the economy grow and things go well during the time of Calvin Coolidge. Herbert Hoover then gets elected, and unfortunately, just a little year after a year, well, not even a year, just what would it be, 8 months or so, 8 to 9 months or so into his term as president, you have the stock market crash in October of 1929, which leads the United States into the Great Depression. Now, we're not going to go into all the factors that made the Great Depression happen. That is something we will cover in U.S. history in great detail. I will say that even in your history book, when they talk about it, I don't agree with what some of it says. There were a wide variety of factors, and the government actually played a large role in doing things to help make the Depression worse, but we're not going to get into that. So as the Depression begins, Herbert Hoover at first doesn't do a lot, but then he tries to get the government involved in trying to fix the problem, and it doesn't fix it. Things continue to get worse. So the Roaring Twenties come to an abrupt end. It says 1/3 of the workforce unemployed, but I think that number's high. In fact, most numbers I've seen, the highest unemployment ever got in the United States was around 27%, and it didn't stay there very long. However, did have a time period when it did stay around 25%, which is an insanely high number. You want your unemployment around 4 to 5% to be about normal. A little lower is good too. 3 to 5% is kind of the range you want to look at. So you're looking at it being about 5-6 times as high as you want it to be during parts of the Great Depression. Obviously, you have an election that comes up between Hoover and FDR. And since the Great Depression happened while Hoover was president, despite the fact that he really isn't to blame for it, because, it's not Hoover's fault that it happened, but some of the things that he did maybe did make it worse. So basically, there's no way he's going to win the election. So the United States elects a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in November of 1932. Things don't get better right away. Well, they don't get better really at all, hardly, while FDR is president, at least until World War II begins. But what I mean by that is Roosevelt gets elected, but it's not until March during this time period in history that the president would take over. So he got elected in November, but he won't take office until March. This means Hoover is still president for about 4 months after losing an election. He can get nothing done. Banks start closing. The Depression gets worse. When FDR comes in, he shuts down banks. He does all kinds of things, sets up all kinds of government programs, and creates what is called the New Deal. The New Deal was job programs, government jobs doing various things. Like I said, we're going to hit this in a lot of detail in a couple years in U.S. history, so I'm not going to take a lot of time here. Trying to make some economic changes. Many people have concluded, and I'm one of the ones that actually agree with this statement, that I think the New Deal and even what Hoover did before Hoover raised American tariffs to the highest rate they've ever been. And it just crashed not just the United States economy, but the problem with this Great Depression is it was the whole world went into a depression because of the way the United States handled it. And I do think the government getting involved so much in trying to fix this economic time period prolonged it and made it worse over time. It didn't make it better. So definitely the New Deal, along with other things, did not help and did not end the Great Depression. The Depression goes all the way until about 1939, 1940. Once World War II begins, the United States begins to see more jobs come again. But that's because all of a sudden we began providing goods to different nations for the war. And also, eventually we get involved in the war. So I am going to also cover a little bit about this next part, the rise of totalitarian dictatorships. So totalitarian just means a government that has total and complete control. You can think of this as dictatorships. Now, Oftentimes, people will look at two different types during this time period: fascists and communists. A little bit later, we're going to look at how they actually are pretty similar. There are a few differences in the phrases they use and in how they go about their things, but you really see them being pretty similar. But here's where you do have similarities between pretty much every totalitarian country that ever has existed, and a lot of them rise up during this time period. One thing they do is they use propaganda to promote the ideas and programs of the state. So propaganda is any materials or methods of indoctrination. So it could be videos, it could be posters, it could be writings, it could be messages on the radio. Nowadays, we probably use the internet, but back then they would not use that. But you would use every method possible. You can think of this almost as advertising, but oftentimes you're not telling the truth in your advertising. You're trying to advertise what you're going to try to create, and you hide maybe some of the ways you're going to go about doing that. Totalitarian states also use secret police to arrest and assassinate opponents. This would be something you definitely would see in Italy, Nazi Germany, and in the Soviet Union. They all use secret police to some degree to arrest opponents and sometimes even assassinate or kill those opponents. Third, they put emphasis of the goals of the state, not the individual rights, as their main concern. So interestingly, this is the same for communism and fascism, which some people would be like, well, isn't fascism a move of the political right? Well, in the United States, the political right means individual rights is what it really is all about. So they both kind of come from the political left, and we'll look at that in more detail later as well. But you're emphasizing here's what's good for the state, so you need to get on board and do what we say you're going to do. It's not about individuals and what they want, it's about what is good for the state. Basically, you then begin to see state control of every aspect of life: politics, economic things, cultural, education, religious parts. Oftentimes, these things would take over religion. Now, we'll look at Italy doesn't do that, but that's because they have concern because of the Catholic Church being so prominent in Italy. But Germany restricted some religious freedoms, and Soviet Union basically tried to take out the church completely. So you also have education, where they try to indoctrinate young people to believe what they want them to believe, which is propaganda, but being used in educational systems. You also have government maintained by force and not accountable to the people. So once these regimes take over, they don't really hold elections, or if they do, you really can't vote anybody out that's really in power. So they maintain it by force. You don't get on board, you possibly could lose your life, be thrown in a prison camp of some kind, concentration camp, whatever it may be. And they are not accountable. That's why I said they can't really get voted out. They do whatever they want, whenever they want. And it is a one-party political system led by a dictator. Okay, so in the fascist countries that developed during this time period and communist countries to this day, you can have one political party. Okay, so like in communist China right now, there's no chance that China is going to have another political party take over because no other parties are allowed. They are illegal. So these are one-party political systems. I have one last question. Two last questions I want you to answer. One of them will be on the assignment I gave you. Another is something that you need to watch this video to know about. But one of the questions I want you to answer is who in Spain, following a bloody civil war, became the new leader of their fascist government? And that person's name is Francisco Franco. And lastly, before I sign off for this particular video, I do have one more question I want you to answer. That question is quite simply a very easy one for you. What is your favorite color? What is your favorite color? All right, signing off. Hope you guys are doing well. I'll have another one of these videos for you in a couple days.